Hey everyone, we'll go ahead and get started. So what I'm going to be doing is we'll be walking through some slides and obviously discussing the OpenAir Advanced Timesheet features. But while I'm doing the webinar, I'm going to mute all the phone lines, and then at the end I'll leave time for questions so that we can use up the full hour.
The conference has been muted.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone. This is the 6th in the Advanced Webinar OpenAir series that we started back in November. I can't believe it's 6 months already. But this is the 6-month mark, and these have been very successful. So we have started to plan out the next 6 months. And our May topic is going to be related to reporting and database export with OpenAir. And we'll be doing it jointly with another customer, so I'm very excited about that. But today we're talking about advanced OpenAir timesheet features. So what I'd like to go through today are alerts and reports, some things that you may not have thought about that are available in OpenAir to take advantage of for alerts and reports that you may be working around in certain ways today. We're going to talk about report periods and different ways you can configure report periods in OpenAir. The timesheet grid, actually there's flexibility in the timesheet grid that you may not have realized. So we'll talk about a little bit regarding that. And my favorite feature, Time Entry tab, those of you who've worked with me over the past year or so, you've heard me mention this feature many times. And now I get to point it out as far as timesheets are concerned. In the approvals area, there's actually a lot of features and functionality within approvals that I want to highlight that you may not remember or notice that have been coming out over the past releases. And then we'll go into overlapping timesheets, specifically month-end timesheets and timesheet adjustments. So let's talk about the alerts. Late timesheet alerts are a pretty common thing that people set up in the system. At least one alert. I've seen as many as 3 or 4, and I've even seen people send them out every 5 minutes as an annoyance reminder to get people to get their timesheets in. But really a timesheet alert is effective if they're infrequent, but a reminder that your timesheet is missing. Okay, so 1 to 3 times is usually a great timing to send the alerts out. But what a lot of people may not realize, especially for those of you who have multiple offices in the U.S. or globally, is that the timesheet alert is going to be much more effective if it's aligned with the time zone of the person. Okay, so if you do have multiple offices, it's always a good idea to work out some way to align the timesheet to be the time zone for them, so that noon, when the noon reminder comes out, it's actually noon their time and not 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 9 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock at night type thing. It'll be much more effective because they see that you've taken into consideration their time zone. Now how can you do that? You would set up multiple alerts, and you would filter the multiple alerts by department. So if you're not familiar with that, let's go into an OpenAir system. And here's a late timesheet alert. Okay, so a lot of times people just set up one alert. They put a date and a time. It's all Eastern time, when it needs to be sent, and they'll send it to everyone. Okay, but there's some filters here that you should be aware of. And specifically when it comes to time zones, typically you can use the user and departments filter to align people to certain departments. Now, of course, many of you are sitting there probably thinking, okay, well, yeah, we have an office in Chicago, but we have telecommuters that work in Michigan and Minneapolis and Kansas. And I'm like, well, you can't solve the whole problem, but at least you can, they know that they report to a central time zone office, so they would get central time zone type reminders. So just something to think about. But one thing that I don't think enough people take advantage of is this timesheet required users option. Okay, this timesheet required users option is actually useful in 2 different places in OpenAir. First off, it's a checkbox on the user demographic record. When you set up a user, you can identify that this person must submit a timesheet, and therefore they would get a reminder because they have to submit weekly timesheets. Okay, fair enough. You've probably seen that checkbox. And if you haven't, let me go quickly to a user. Scroll down to the timesheets area, and here's that timesheet required checkbox. So just by using that as a control or a filter to say the only people that should be getting alerts are the ones that I require a timesheet from. Now the other place that it's useful, so if you're using it to make sure that the alerts come out great, then you can also use it on the advanced report called Timesheet Status, which of course many of you are using. But what you may not have noticed is that you can also use it here. So if you're requiring a timesheet on each person, the alert can pay attention to that checkbox, and so can this timesheet status report. So you get everything all synced up. So it's just a feature I think a lot of people forget about because the user filters are here and department filters are here, and the timesheet required is actually a pretty powerful checkbox feature that you can take advantage of. There's also a daily time entry alert. This is a fairly new feature. It came out about a year ago. And a daily time alert is meant to say that you have not saved any time on your timesheet for today. Okay, so you'll get the reminder that, hey, you missed putting time on your timesheet today. So when it comes to less is more type rule, a lot of people don't really want to have the system send out a daily reminder. But a daily reminder doesn't hurt in the situation where you are actually doing forecasting for your company based on actual time reported on the time system. So if you're not familiar with the forecasting, it's a feature that's under the project settings called charge projections. And under there you can configure what is driving your forecast. Two of the options involve worked hours, which means any hour on any timesheet, along with bookings, or a worked hour along with task assignments. So if you're doing a forecast with those worked hours, it is important for people to put their timesheet on their time on their timesheet every single day. So this daily timesheet entry may make sense for your organization. Okay? But otherwise I would agree it's overkill. But for those of you who rely on accurate forecasting, this may be something you want to look into. Now, timesheet rules. Many times people say, okay, well I have a 40-hour work week, or I only must require 8 hours a day. And just as a friendly reminder that if you're not aware of it, when you're configuring timesheet information, it doesn't have to be a strict static number of hours, especially for those of you who have subcontractors or you have global offices such as in Europe where they don't have necessarily a 40-hour work week. If you haven't seen this before, there's actually a rule configuration form that you use to actually configure OpenAir behind the scenes for it to understand whether you have an error on your timesheet or a warning on your timesheet. And these rules only get checked when you submit your time. Okay, so you may go around and tell people you can't put more than 24 hours in a day, and they'll say, ha ha ha, yes I can, look it, let me save it with 27. Okay, that's fine, but the minute they submitted it, it's not going to work. Okay, so there's a series of minimum and maximum hours available on these timesheet rules. And you notice that there's two options here. There's fixed hours, and then there's percentage of work schedule hours. And typically people will use percentage of work schedule hours if there's anything related to rules where you have to submit a full-time timesheet. So a full-time timesheet is not necessarily 40 hours. Okay, it could be whatever is defined as the person's work calendar or work schedule in the system. So saying 100% of a work schedule is something that's much more flexible. So just to point that out to you in case you weren't aware of that. There's also a series of other controls on the timesheet rules now, specifically one for those of you who are new to the system you may be able to take advantage of. Many of you who have been with the system for many years, you wouldn't be able to take advantage of it. But there's new options that that allow you to not have to select a project at all. You can just select a time type. I call it work sites, to say that I'm taking vacation or I'm taking holiday. Those are all for features that newer customers can take advantage of because they don't have legacy data in the system. But the timesheet rules does provide more flexibility. So if you haven't looked at this recently, take a look because there's actually been quite a few features added since you may have had the system in the past year related to timesheet rules, and see if there's something that you could take advantage of here to catch more errors along the way. In the advanced reporting feature, the timesheet status, as I just showed you, a report that is probably one of the most used and most useful reports in the OpenAir system, because it can tell you where a timesheet is at any point, missing, for example, submitted, and so forth. Now, a useful tip that you may want to take advantage of is, remember, you can actually schedule reports to run and have the reports email you directly. So think about the people who you have to escalate to managers to say, hey, this person's not submitting their timesheet or all their timesheet is missing. You're probably doing that manually, sending emails, calling people on the phone. But what you could do also to kind of give yourself a little bit of a break is set up one of these timesheet status reports by manager. Set up the filter by manager. Then schedule that report to run on Tuesday night and have it email the manager directly saying, here's have it be an exception report. Only give me things that are missing, open, or submitted or rejected. Okay, and have that email the manager. That way the manager actually gets an exception report, and you don't have to deal with individual emails and calling people and stuff. I'm not saying it completely replaces all that, the human element in there, but at least it keeps things together so the managers can see a trend of what's going on with certain people, perhaps. Okay? So the next topic I thought would be interesting is to talk about timesheet periods. So when you got your OpenAir system or where you configured your OpenAir system, you probably got the question of, well, how do you put timesheets in? And most of you say weekly. Okay, I do have a couple customers that use semi-monthly or monthly timesheets. Okay, I don't actually have anyone that uses daily, but that is an option in the system. So great, you have timesheets that are weekly, and then you acquire a company. You acquire a company that uses monthly timesheets. So here's that merger and acquisition dilemma that you run into is, do you force them to go to weekly or do you let them keep monthly because that's the way they've always worked with the company? I'm here to tell you that, that you still have that decision, but it's not a system restriction decision. It's definitely a best practice process decision for your organization because OpenAir actually allows you to have variable time periods for your timesheets. What it does is it actually allows you to control what kind of timesheet period you use at the user level. So there's an internal switch to say that you can designate it at the user level. And what you can basically mimic then is that an entire subsidiary, an entire department, an entire company that's using the same system as yours could have a completely different time period on their timesheets than you do. Okay, and specifically I worked in one of my first OpenAir experiences when I was working at Software AG. This is exactly what we had to take advantage of. Is we had weekly timesheet companies, we had monthly timesheet companies. In the end of the day, it's still stored day by day in the database, so reporting is not impacted by this. The only thing that's really impacted is timing, right? So if you have weekly timesheets due, you tend to get time entry more consistently than when you have monthly timesheets due, and then people will fill their timesheet in at the end of the month. So you don't necessarily get actuals on timesheets throughout the month. But you definitely can set different time periods in the system and have different organizations or companies use different time periods. A single person can only have one time period though, so you're either a weekly person or a semi-monthly person or a monthly person, but it's still a flexibility that a lot of people are not aware of. If you are using something like a weekly timesheet, there are a couple of functionalities that I find instances for based on people who use a lot of subcontractors. Okay, specifically, it's something to prevent subcontractors from putting old timesheets in the system that, the time is so old, you can't bill the customer for that time or pass through that time, and it's really sort of enforcing the policy of you really, really should get your timesheets in on time. That's a requirement. And if you wait 3 months, you're not going to get paid as a contractor because we can't recoup that fee. Okay? And that functionality is called Open Periods. Now, the Open Periods functionality is also available in expense reports, and that's where I see it most often because there's usually a policy that says, we'll reimburse you for your expenses as long as you get them in a reasonable time, meaning within 6 weeks of your travel. But the same functionality is available for time periods, timesheets. And it really would be useful for people like contractors to say, you can't put a timesheet in that's older than 2 months, okay, or 6 weeks or something. And what that allows you to do is basically put the available time periods in the system to say timesheets are allowed during these, these 6 weeks, and it's just a rolling 6 weeks that someone centrally updates. Now, what that also allows you to do is prevent future time from going into the system. It's a general option to prevent future time from going into the system if you decide that you don't want any future time whatsoever. But when you do that, be aware that it does prevent people from putting timesheets in advance when they take things like vacation. Okay? So let's move on to timesheet grid fields. There is a timesheet grid field called payroll type. Now, a lot of people don't use payroll type, but it is a great feature to reuse in the system because what it allows you to do is rename it and use it to capture something completely different because it's available for reporting and you can subtotal by it when you're dealing with summary reports. So the payroll type field is a drop-down that can show up on your timesheet grid. And what we work with a lot of customers on is actually naming this like customer location or work location. And that allows people to say where they were doing the work, what state, what country they were doing the work, to support tax purposes. And this being the month for tax, of course, this is on the first and foremost of everyone's mind. And this is the time of year that we get a lot of questions to say, hey, how can I do this better for next year? But then once taxes is over, people forget about it, so we hear about it again April 1st. Hey, how can we do this for next year? So we're definitely very used to implementing something like this for folks. So if you're interested, definitely drop us a call now before you forget about it after the taxes are all done. Other people that we worked with on this payroll type, maybe you're using a single account for your contractors. They just log in with a single account in your OpenAir system and they're entering time for all their different contractors. Well, you can use that payroll type as sort of a contractor role, for example, and be able to set up values that would be in drop-down. So you could say, we spent 24 hours as a project manager, we spent 32 hours as a database manager, and then we wrote testing scripts as a QA person. Okay, so lots of flexibility here with the payroll type. It's really just a matter of, do you need some other field to designate or describe the data that you're working on a project? Time types. So time types are used quite often. One of the reasons that time types are used quite often is they're also something that can be controlled through the billing rules. Now, if you're using time billing rules, you may remember that you have filter control by the user, by the task, and by the service of what's being used on the project. But there's also a filter on time type, and time type comes from the timesheets. So in the use of this feature, what I commonly see is people using billable, non-billable as a time type on timesheets. When you do that, you're giving the consultant control to identify whether something is billable or non-billable. So really what that comes down to is a decision of, does the consultant have control, or do we handle it through something like task type when we're dealing with the project to let the project manager have control? And of course, if you're putting something on a timesheet, you also want to have it be part of the review and approval process. But time type, billable, non-billable, is quite often used. I also see it quite often when it's dealing with situations where you can't track things like overtime. OpenAir does have a time card functionality, but it still doesn't recognize, okay, this is after hours. You usually have to handle that with special task setup or with time types to say, these 4 hours that I work, they were actually overtime hours or off-shift hours. And then those can also be used in the billing rules because you may have negotiated a different bill rate for customers if you work after hours from their normal workday. The last scenario that I use, and this is actually that I've seen that I actually use, is a designation of whether you're on-site or remote. And what I use is I use a combination of this time type to identify whether somebody's on-site or remote in conjunction with the location field. I use payroll type and I renamed it work location. And what that provides to me is, okay, great, the customer is in New York. But if I'm working remotely, I don't really care that I care they're in New York, but it doesn't impact me from a tax perspective if I'm working remotely to support them. But the minute I go on site in New York, then I have to make sure I pay attention to that because I'm earning the revenue in New York. And so by using a combination of time type with my location field, now I can get a full report of, okay, we knew where the customer and the offices were, but from a tax reporting perspective, I can tell what revenue I've earned by being on site versus remotely. Okay? So time type is actually a pretty powerful field, very flexible, but a lot of people jump immediately to say, oh, it must be for billable, non-billable. It doesn't have to be for billable, non-billable. It can be for a lot of different things. And if you want to take a look at what our timesheets look like in Top Step, we definitely take advantage of the payroll type for work location and the time type field for work site. I turned it off in the sandbox, but in our production environment, our work site is, if it's just internal stuff, none, off-site, on-site, remote, and the customer locations are countries and states. Well, what if you have quite a few time types? In working with customers, I get all kinds of requests. You know, we want to track travel, vacation, internal, after hours, pre-sales, non-billable, billable. So the list grows to be, 15, 20 things. And you don't want to make those valid for every single project task combination that you're available for, that's available in the system. When you're recording time against an internal or admin or overhead project, billable doesn't apply. Okay, non-billable probably doesn't even apply if you have like an admin type. And so, how can you limit that? And that's what our tip was this week on our website. Was you can actually limit time types by task or by project. You can pick one or the other. And what that does is when you're recording time on your timesheet for that project or that task, the time type drop-down, or whatever you named it to, is limited to what it recognizes. Okay, so it's another way to prevent errors on timesheets that people just make innocently enough because, well, it allows me to set it, so it must be okay. All right. So especially for those internal projects, those administrative, overhead, operational, whatever you call those projects that are not client-based, the selecting or limiting time type by those are the ones that typically you don't want to pull in billable or non-billable or pre-sales type thing. You really want it to be internal or vacation. And then when you deal with the client situation, you don't want people to pick vacation with a client project. They can't be vacation when they're going to the client, right? So this option is an internal switch that you can have OpenAir support turn on for you, and you can either do it at the task level or the project, one or the other. And when you set the limitations, the timesheets then become much more accurate as a result. So here's my favorite feature, the time entry tab. And what I like about the time entry tab is it's actually almost replaces the detailed time entry report. Okay, because everything you need to look up typically on that detailed report where you have to go into the report interface and filter and configure the date ranges and stuff, you can do just within the time entry tab. And if you haven't seen it before, it's a feature that you can email OpenAir support to turn on, and it shows the tab in the timesheets module. Now, a nice thing about this timesheet entry, it's controlled at the role level, so you can actually allow people at, based on the role that they're assigned in the system, whether they should have access to time entries or not. But once you have it turned on, you can see how, many times you're like, well, how many hours have we worked in the month of March? for a certain customer. And that's when you start just taking advantage of the fact that there's columns and filters here that you can look at. Say, okay, March, and the Rich August. In March, Rich August worked, for 3M, 16 hours. Okay? So here you can actually see how many hours. You can see the project, the client, the task. You can see information about the timesheet itself. And there's other forms or columns that you can add, like the project job code that was on the task, if you have that feature turned on, approval status. You could add the customer location, the payroll type, or the time type, which is I call worksheet, a worksite. So you can add all these things to the columns, which are basically the same as what you would have to do if you went into the reports module, the detail reports. Then go down to that time entries and work with all these date fields. Okay? Now, of course, not all of the date fields are available for filtering on the columns in the time entry tab. So you may have to come back here for certain things that are related to custom date fields, for example. But I would think probably about 90% of the time you should be able just to use the time entry tab to look up information. Now, if you weren't aware of the time entry tab, it was actually initially released as a feature focused on subcontractor time reconciliation against invoices. So a T&M contractor would send an invoice, and then you could actually check off or mark off individual time entries that would match up to that invoice. And those are additional features that we can turn on, that you can turn on and set up in the system to do. And here's an example of what I just showed you. So now I'm going to move on to approvals. And I've got a few slides on approvals because even though approvals seem very straightforward, I think there's a lot of control here that people forget about in the system. And so you try to work around it by hard coding things or just telling people, ignore this, ignore that. So an approval process allows approvers to be sequential or first one in, meaning I'm going to send it to these three people, whoever gets to it first can approve it. Okay, I think that's a pretty common knowledge level amongst folks that are using approval processes. And how that really works is you set the approver levels, and the sequence number is the key here. When you check a sequence number requires only one approval, that's a first one situation. So whoever gets to it first is the one who approves it. Now an email goes to both people, so you can't avoid that because OpenAir has to notify the people first that there's a timesheet. But whoever gets to it is the one that actually is the approver. So don't forget about that. And you can mix and match, right? You can say, okay, it always goes to the project owner first, and then the second tier is either of these two managers, whoever gets to it, and then the third tier is, finance. And so you can do this with a lot of the approvals in the system. You can mix and match the sequence versus, the same sequence versus sequential approvals. What I've started doing in approval process is actually adding people as a same sequential level that just want to be notified when there's time against a project. There's really no other nice way to do that I know of, unless you guys definitely at the end of the call point out some ways that you've handled it. But I'll get requests to say, I just want Johnny to always get an email when somebody records time against vacation. Okay, they don't need to approve it; they just need to be aware of it. And they're not a reviewer typically of that project, so I would set up an approval process that would include Johnny for all the people that he manages. And Johnny would get a notice to say, hey, you have a timesheet ready for your approval. But he knows that's not his responsibility. He knows he's only getting that because he wanted to get FYI'd on things. And what that does is it removes the reliance on people to rekey in an email address when they go to submit something. If you rely on the individual to always fill out that CC, you will get a handful of people that do it right and a whole lot of people who do it wrong or just forget about it. So taking advantage of things like this sequential field and the fact that OpenAir will send everyone a notification can meet those needs fairly effectively. Another thing to keep in mind, as you saw when I went to the next slide, is you always have the option to say, okay, if I'm actually going to be my self-approver, especially with project managers, this happens a lot. If I submit my timesheet or my expense report and I am the first approver in line, well, of course, if I don't do anything different with the process, I'm going to auto-approve my own stuff. And the concern in a lot of cases is I don't want project managers approving their own expenses. Okay. So what you can do is in the next column over, or as a general setting, if you are the approver, so you're going to self-approve, basically send it to someone else. Okay? And what it typically happens in a setup like this, see how it says project owner and then manager, what you'll see is actually people will put manager over here as well. So if it's the project owner, it just skips that first level and goes right to the manager. Okay? So it will go right to the person's manager instead of going to the project owner. So take advantage of this configuration item if you want to prevent self-approvals automatically happening. And so here's a few things regarding auto-approve. So many times you see this, auto-approve rules, and I see people try these and then they don't work the way they expect, so they just abandon them. But when it comes to timesheets, the auto-approve rule that I think that would be useful is to sort of notify the person's manager when the person is working way too many hours in a week or in a month, for example. Kind of, give them a heads up that this person is putting in way too many hours and there's a potential burnout situation. Now, you're probably all shaking your head going, well, that's just the way work is. But people can't sustain a 120-hour work week for weeks on end. There comes a point where that person will, get sick, like I am, or they just need a break, right? So at least the manager should be aware that there's somebody who's working an excessive number of hours. So that's what auto-approve rules can actually be used for. And how you would do that on an auto-approve rule, if I go into the system, and what the auto-approve rule are, that's why the concept is a little backwards, to be honest. The auto-approve is basically don't send it to the person unless, this criteria is met, okay? So let's say Rich August. I only want Rich August to get a timesheet if the person is working more than 60 hours in a week. Okay, I'm going to call that excessive. And I'm sure people are out there laughing about that. So here's my timesheet auto-approve rule, okay? And first you have to activate this part of the rule. And as you can see, this is a single, use it for everything that possibly would need to be auto-approved. And the same applies for expenses, by the way. So once you get this for timesheets, expenses, usually there's some kind of tiered sign-off level. As a project manager, I can sign off on $500. If it's more than that, it has to go to my manager. If it's more than that, it has to go to the CFO, blah, blah, blah. Okay? But in this case, what I'm going to say is I want to automatically approve this timesheet if it is less than 60 hours. That seems backwards because really what I wanted to do is I wanted to send it to Rich if it's more than 60 hours. But what auto-approve says is as long as it's less than 60 hours, show in the approval history that it automatically is approved. It's not going to route it to Rich, so Rich will never know about it. If it's 60 or 61 hours, then that's greater than the 60. So I do want it. It will route to Rich. So it's not going to auto-approve. It's going to route to Rich. Okay, so it's a little reverse thinking there. So anything that he shouldn't see, that's what the rule should be set up to be. So that's what auto-approve means. So the same type of logic when you come to expense reports. So doing something like that would actually give more information. It's not necessarily something that you want, a manager say that, they must be in the loop to approve stuff. Maybe you can just have it be an informational notification and have someone else be the approver as well. But it's a way to take advantage of what OpenAir has to offer and still provide more information out to the managers when it comes to their resources and the time they're spending. Okay? And then the last bullet on here is something that you may not have realized. Every now and then I get the question of, well, should we allow people to edit the timesheets? And I'll get a mixed answer. We don't want the project managers. We want the project managers to edit, but we don't want the managers to edit it. So if it goes to a project manager first, they should be able to fix the hours for their project, but we don't want the manager to modify anything. They're just doing a rubber stamp so that they see what's going on with the timesheet. Okay, that's fine. But the ability for a reviewer to edit a submitted timesheet is a global option. It's in the timesheet settings area of the system. Oops. And it's either you can edit or you can't edit a submitted timesheet. Okay. So how do you handle those two situations? Okay, allow an approver to edit a submitted timesheet. But how do you mix and match it? How do you prevent one person but not another? And that actually is something that's configured on the approval process. So if you didn't see it, here on the project owner, no, actually we did the reverse in the example I was just talking about, but this checkbox here overrides the global settings. So this particular person cannot edit the timesheet, but the next person can because we've turned that feature on globally. So the approval process is actually a second layer of security on top of that approval process feature, or that edit submitted timesheet feature. Now, many of you also have the situation where you have more than one project manager, and there's only one project manager or project owner field on the project. So how can I get more people in there so I have sort of two project managers that have to get notified, or two or three people that have to be involved in the timesheet approval process, and it's whoever gets in first. So what I see a lot of people do before this feature was available is they would hard code named approval process. So this is Tina's approval process. This is Jody's approval process. This is Ron's approval process. And it would have hard-coded names in the process, so you would just set that out of the project according to whoever the project owner was. Well, you don't have to do that anymore because there's actually a feature called Additional Project-Specific Approvers. And when you activate this, it provides 3 more names that you can put in drop-downs at the bottom of the project form called Project Approver 1, Project Approver 2, Project Approver 3. You don't need to use all 3. They completely are controlled by form permission, so if you want to hide them, you're more than welcome to. What that allows you to do is set multiple project managers on the same project and set up a generic approval process for timesheets. So I want it to be project owner and then project approver 1. Or I want it to go to the project owner and the project approver at the same time, and whoever gets to it gets to it. Okay? So it's a sequence number. So this is an internal switch to activate, and it's activate more project-specific approvers. You get up to 3 additional names that you can have, and they're generic dynamic references, just like the project owner field and the manager field, that you can set up in your approval process and make things much more generic. It does reduce administration, obviously, because now you don't have to maintain those individual named processes, and God forbid someone leaves the company. Now you have to go and update all those projects with those named processes because now the process, maybe you had to change the whole process about it. Okay. Now there is one caution with using this. If you do set up an approval process that says you must get approval from project owner 1, well, if there's no project owner 1 on the project, it's going to auto-approve. Okay, so just be aware of that. Just like anything, if there's no value there, it's going to auto-approve for that. Another feature that that came out recently, and it allows basically what I call an escalation, but it's really a rerouting of the timesheet. And what that allows you to do is, as you define people in rows in sequence, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, if an approver at a certain sequence number does not get to it after a certain number of days, it will automatically route the timesheet to the next person and skip basically that person's approval requirement. And that feature actually shows up on a timesheet process here, assign after so many days. So this is how you can, those weekly or those monthly time date deadlines that you have to meet, you can put in here, it says after 2 days, if the person hasn't gotten to it, I need to move it on. I need to move it on through the sequence and let the other people in the review process get to it. Okay? So if this project owner takes more than 2 days to get something, I'm going to route it to the manager right away because I really need to get this stuff done. Okay, so just think about that. It's an internal switch also to allow the assign after or rerouting type thing, I like to call it. And it's used more for escalation, okay, in case you find that people are holding up timesheet approvals because they're literally just out of town traveling or whatever. Now, I get this question a lot, especially for new people using the system. I get an email for every project that I'm working with, and every time I go into approve a timesheet, if I'm the owner of more than one project on that timesheet, I have to hit approve 1, 2, 3. I have to hit approval every single time. It's like I'm approving the same timesheet over and over and over again. Why do I have to do that? Okay, well, first off, one, I can't solve the email problem. The emails are controlled at the project level, so if you are a multiple project owner, you will get an email per project. So people solve that by putting rules on their inbox and stuff like that to kind of clean that out or just delete them as they come in. But there is a thing to solve as far as having them hit the approve button for individual pieces on the timesheet. And what that is, it's an internal switch that says if you're allowed to see all the time entries, which means you can see all of your project time at the same time. Like I'm in charge of 3 projects, but I can see all the time for the 3 projects at the same time. The minute you hit approve, it'll approve it for all those projects, okay? Which actually is a big time saver when you think about it, because now I don't have to hit it 3 times, I just hit it once. Now I do have to point out, however, that if you do have the filtering when you hit approve, you are still approving it for everything on the timesheet. And when I talk about filtering, what I mean is if I go to this timesheet, oh, that's not a good one. That's not a good one either. My goodness. Let's go way back. Oh. If I'm looking at a timesheet report, I get this project filter. So a lot of times when people are looking at the approvals, they'll say, okay, well, I can see all 3 of my projects, but if I filter on internal activities and I hit approve, I'm only going to approve for this project. That is not true. When you hit approve, you still be approving for all 3 projects. So there's the trade-off right there. You get the one button action, but you have to make sure you actually agree with all 3 projects worth of time in the system. Okay, but it is a big time saver. There's also the ability to do line item rejection in case you're not aware of that, which means you can reject pieces of the timesheet or approve pieces of the timesheet. And what that does is basically allows you to create fragmented timesheets. Why is that good? Because you may have timesheets you may have resources that are shared between companies, between countries, between departments, and one department is really ready to start working on billing and they don't want to be held up by a different department or a different company. So if you use the line item rejection and also this expanded line item rejection, which allows you to sort of hit approve and reject by each time entry and then hit one big button, it allows you to actually track approved pieces and let people go ahead and start billing against those approved pieces while the rest of the timesheet is in review. So if you are working with people that are shared among offices and you run into that timing thing, I can't do my billing because Jody over there hasn't done their timesheet approvals yet, and it's just holding up my timesheet because my pieces are approved. I'm just waiting for the full timesheet to get approved. You may want to consider looking at this line item rejection. It's not a perfect solution for everyone, and there's additional features available here because some people don't like fragmented timesheets. They want it pulled all together back into the original timesheet. Those features are available in OpenAir. So before you make a decision on which way to go, I would definitely look at sandboxes and play with the line item rejection, the fragmentation, and if you want to pull it back together to original timesheets to see if it does meet the requirements of what you're challenged with as far as timing of doing billing against approved time entries Okay, but the line item rejection is actually quite popular recently because people just want more control at the individual time level versus the whole timesheet is rejected or the whole timesheet is approved. So here's the topic about the rejoin. Now the last two topics are overlapping timesheets. So many of you are aware that there's overlapping timesheet capability in the system. You just create a duplicate timesheet basically, click the box that says overlapping timesheets, and now you can have a timesheet for that same week. Okay? But the frustration comes in when people are working with weekly timesheets. And the weekly timesheets cover 2 different months, such as the last week of March. The last week of March for almost everyone covered March and the first couple days of April. So when you're in that situation and you're on a company that does monthly billing, there's a couple of solutions that companies come up with. They adjust their calendar to be a 4-4-5, which means it's basically they're doing everything on a 4-week, 4-week, 5-week. So they're not really paying attention to the month-end activities. They ask people to guesstimate how many hours they're working in advance for the next month and submit it. And then, of course, if they're off, they have to do corrections in the next month. Or they'll say submit 2 timesheets for the same week, one finishing up March in this example and one starting up April. But when you do the 2 timesheets in the same week, how often are your people forgetting to clear out the hours, or they're putting double time in? You run into duplication. It's just, sometimes that becomes very error prone. So there is actually a feature in OpenAir that says prevent people from putting time on 2 different months on the same timesheet. And what that does is I like to call it the proper month-end timesheet. When you have this feature turned on, and I'll show you a picture here, when you have this feature turned on, then when the person creates the first timesheet for the week, you'll see how in this example, March is ready for data entry, but April is blocked out. That's because you're not allowed to put time on 2 different months on the same timesheet. It becomes a month-end timesheet. So once you've saved this, now you create another one for the overlapping, and it says, okay, well, you've already put time in for March, so you're only allowed to put time in April, and you can't put time in March because that's a different month, and you've already put time on the timesheet. So this month-end, prevent time entry across months on the same timesheet gives you that month-end control, and it does help the accuracy of data report or time entry for your consultants because now they know they can't put time in. Now they know they can't rekey in duplicate time, and it really will save a lot of the timesheet corrections you're probably having to deal with in the system. And speaking of timesheet corrections, I hope everyone is aware of this timesheet adjustment feature. If you're not, at least take this nugget home with you. Before timesheet adjustments were available, the correction options were, okay, go unapprove the timesheet, tell the consultant to fix it or proxy in as the consultant, resubmit it, go through the approval process again, and now it's fixed. Or they would say, okay, go ahead and create a duplicate timesheet for the same week. Go ahead and you'd either proxy it as the person or you'd have the person do it where they would add negative hours and positive hours to fix the timesheet like they were supposed to, then resubmit it. And so the person would have 2 timesheets, but one would be a correction timesheet. Okay? The third option, however, which was introduced by OpenAir, is called a timesheet adjustment. And the beauty of this feature is it does not require any proxy. So for those of you who have a huge proxy table because you're having to deal with timesheet corrections all the time, this will be a huge time savings for you. The timesheet adjustment feature is an internal switch that you can have OpenAir support turn on, and it's something that you can control at the role level. So not everyone would be able to do a timesheet adjustment. You can make that be for local admins, finance, managers, so forth. But what it does is when you have a fully approved timesheet, you go into the timesheet and you basically click on an option that says adjust this timesheet. And you fix the timesheet to be the way it should look. When you do that, OpenAir will actually create what they call the adjusting timesheet or the correction timesheet. And you'll get more than one timesheet, but you'll see the word adjusted, and that's how the adjustment works. Now, if you have just the adjustment feature turned on, you still have to proxy as the person and submit it. Or you can turn on the other part of the feature which says, and if I create an adjustment timesheet, just automatically approve it. I don't want to have to proxy at all. Okay? So it really is as simple as going into an approved timesheet, clicking on Enter Time, scrolling down to the bottom in the tips area. Oh goodness, maybe I'm not in an approved timesheet. Click on Adjust this timesheet. Make it look the way it's supposed to. Okay, in this case I should have worked 4 hours here and only 2 hours here. Click Save. And it'll create an adjustment to say, okay, well, I'm removing the original hours and I'm putting on the corrected hours here. And you can add notes. Correcting per client feedback. And then create the adjusting timesheet. And now the adjusting timesheet, I've got the system set up so it automatically approves it. So if I look at the approved timesheets for that, I see I have 2 timesheets. And this one says negative 4.5 hours only because it's an adjustment timesheet. So when I run billing, it will actually pick this one up as well. So really big time savings for those of you who have to do corrections all the time. So I did have to cover quite a bit in the, quickly at the end there, but I wanted to make sure we got through everything and open up the phone for questions. So just know that there's a lot of features and there are a lot of options on timesheets. So if you think there's just one way to do timesheets, definitely send us questions. We'll let you know if it's possible or if it's not possible. And for those of you who are not aware of who Top Step Consulting is, we are a partner with many companies out there, but we work primarily with OpenAir. We are experts with OpenAir as far as coming from industry. We're very much process oriented, and we work a lot with your organization specifically to look at how you're doing your operations, how you're using OpenAir, and point out features just like this. The business efficiency assessment offering we have was what we founded the company on, and it's still a very, very hot offering today. And we are introducing other things to help you, such as report guides, report training, and a new feature called ladder metrics. It will give you a maturity estimates and how to get more out of the system from a trending and a metrics perspective. So definitely get a hold of us if you have questions about this or questions about anything that we've covered in our webinars, because we're definitely here to help you. So with that, I'm going to open up the phone lines to entertain questions if you guys have any.
The conference has been unmuted.
And we have about 5 minutes left, so if you have any questions, go right ahead.
Hey Jody, it's Gary speaking.
Hi Gary.
Hello. Quick question about the overlapping timesheets. Can that be set to be for quarterly boundaries as opposed to monthly boundaries?
The overlapping timesheet, you mean for the like the proper month-end situation?
Correct.
There's actually 2 switches when it comes to that that time entry restriction. One is for the month end, so you can't put time on multiple months so at the same time sheet. But there's another option, which is actually a feature I have turned on in my system. It says if I submit a duplicate timesheet for the same week, I'm not allowed to put any time on any day that already has time on it. So if I happen to create 2 timesheets by mistake and I've put time on Monday and Tuesday on one timesheet, doesn't matter whether it's month end or not. When I create the second one, I can't put time again on Monday and Tuesday. I've already got time on a different timesheet for that. So that's the only other option there.
Okay, so I can't adjust it to be quarterly as a, okay, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions out there?
Hey Jody.
Yeah.
This is James with eVerge Group.
Hi.
How can you delete an approved timesheet?
So the deletion of an approved timesheet, there's a dependency. The first dependency is the timesheet cannot have gone through billing already. So as long as the timesheet hasn't been processed through any kind of time billing rules, you should have the ability to unapprove it. Once you unapprove it, then you can go to the properties or the edit timesheet link, depending on what your UI says, and the delete button will be there. Administrators can always delete timesheets, but So if you're running into a limitation of trying to delete someone else's timesheet, it may be because you're not a full administrator. But a person itself, once you want to approve it, they should be, and return it back to open, they should be able to delete it. Now, if you've processed any part of it through time charges, like time billing, you can't delete it because it's already recorded in the system linked to something else.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I don't know why we got some that haven't been processed, but we still can't delete them. So.
Okay. Well, actually, just why don't you send us an example of one of those? We'll work with you on that.
You're ready. Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions out there?
Yeah, I actually have 2 questions.
Yes.
Is it possible to populate time with assigned out, like populate the timesheet with assigned hours for the week?
Okay, great question. Okay, you can't do it with assignments, but there is a little known feature that says based on booked hours, repopulate the timesheet based on bookings.
Bookings, okay.
So it is available. My only caution when people consider doing that is it does, not to say that your consultants fall into this category, but it does promote a sense of laziness because people see that their timesheet's already filled out, so they just hit save and submit. So consider that and the way that your consultants, their busy schedule and stuff like that. Check to see if they actually will update the hours to be accurate versus what the bookings say.
Okay. And then my second question is it possible to allow a user to edit, say, the project, not a user, is it possible to allow an approver to edit the project that's on the timesheet but not the time that's been entered?
Oh, good question. Okay, so in that case, you would want to prevent the person from editing the timesheet. So you could do that through just the global setting that anyone reviewing a timesheet can't edit it. Or you could use the approval process to restrict it based on the level that they're doing it. But you can give them edit capability to the project. That's a role-based permission to say that whether they're allowed to edit the project or not.
So they could be, like the project manager could, when they're approving the timesheet, switch which project it's on if they have project editing capabilities. But they couldn't modify the time entered to that project.
Right. So they could edit the project to fix the planned hours, for example, but they may be prevented from editing the timesheet itself. Yep.
Great.
Any other questions from anyone? Oh, we're listening to someone else put us on hold. Sorry about that.
Hey, Jody, this is George.
Uh-huh.
Got a quick question. On the assign after a certain number of days on the approval process?
Yeah.
I assume you could easily put in there the auto approve. If they don't approve it after a week, we're just going to auto approve.
You could do the auto approve like just put it to the next level and then it would auto approve.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, cool.
You could. I haven't actually tried that though. Like route it to the next line and there's no one in the next line or self approval in the next line. That would probably work. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. I'll
Good idea.
Hey Jody, Jeremy with Rocket Software.
Yeah, hi Jeremy.
How are you? We were looking at turning on the option for the month-end timesheets where you have to submit both of them, and a portion of it was grayed out.
Yeah.
But at the time, I believe we ran into some sort of limitation, and I don't know if it was adjusting time entries or do you know if something like that still exists out there? If there's a limitation, once you turn that on, if there's something you can't do afterwards?
Yeah, so the challenge you'll run into is when you do a timesheet adjustment. You can do a timesheet adjustment, but if you do any kind of unapproval and try to fix the timesheet manually, you'll run into some problems. That only happens. That only happens if you happen to have the timesheet for March and a timesheet for April, and then you did an adjustment on top of that. Because if you do, it'll let you do a timesheet adjustment on top of either of those pieces. But if you try to fix either the adjustment or only the March time or only the April time, then it's going to prevent you from trying to save it again because it's already got time on that time sheet. So that's the only limitation is that you try to do an adjustment on top of the split.
Okay, thank you.
And I ran into that myself because I have it, in general you can't save it if you have more than time on one day than the other. So it's a bit of a trick to work around. Good questions. Anyone else? All right, well, thanks again for joining, everyone. I hope you got a lot out of it, or at least a little bit more than you already knew. And if there's anything we can help you with here at TopStep, please don't hesitate to call us, email us, or definitely pay attention. We've started a blog on our website and our weekly tips that are coming out every Wednesday. Thanks a lot.